brought to you by Charity Mobile, the phone company that sends 5% of your monthly plan price to your favorite charity. No contracts, nationwide coverage, risk-free guarantee. Learn more at CharityMobile.com. While our eyes have been turned mostly to the internal state of the church itself and the mess that's going on inside the church, the truth of the matter is that her enemies have not been sleeping. They've been very much awake and trying to undermine the freedom of the church by going after the integrity of the sacraments themselves. In America and elsewhere, this usually takes the form of the state trying to break the seal of confession, which is the subject of our story today. Several U.S. state legislatures have been targeting the confessional with new legislation. That isn't really new, and it all comes from one particular party. Their stated goal is to provide transparency and protection for those who need it the most, but their unstated objective is control over the church. Our story takes us first to the state of Delaware, which is itself rarely in the headlines for much of anything, but is now because the state legislature is actively targeting freedom of religion. Headline from Crux Now. Diocese of Wilmington insists that confessional secrecy is non-negotiable. In Delaware, the state legislature is considering a law to break the seal of confession under certain circumstances. Okay, so here's a timely reminder. Any priest who breaks the seal of confession automatically excommunicates himself. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's as simple as that. Even the worst of the hierarchy in our times have been decent about defending the seal of confession against the encroachments and overreaches of the secular world, and the Bishop of Wilmington is speaking out against the state's overreach here. So, from that article, quote, after a Delaware state representative introduced a bill to abrogate the privilege between priest and penitent relating to suspected Ted McCarrick problems or neglect, the Diocese of Wilmington has pushed back that the confidentiality of the sacrament is a non-negotiable. The sacrament of confession and its seal of confession is a fundamental aspect of the Church's sacramental theology and practice, the diocese said in a March 7th statement. It is non-negotiable. No Catholic priest or bishop would ever break the seal of confession under any circumstances, it added. To do so would incur an automatic excommunication that could only be pardoned by the Pope himself. The proposed bill, HB 74, was proposed by State Representative Eric Morrison of the Party of Moloch on March 2nd. If eventually passed, it would amend the Title 16 of the Delaware Code relating to such reporting of Ted McCarrick problems. Morrison did not return a Crux request for comment on the bill. End quote. Of course he didn't. Again, Morrison is a member of the Party of Moloch, as I refer to them on this channel whenever they come up in discussions. The diocese has a history of dealing with the Ted McCarrick problems among the clergy, having paid out settlements in that diocese in the tens of millions of dollars in the past decade and a half or so. But the history of this problem in a diocese does not undermine the teaching of a bishop trying to defend that teaching, or the integrity of that teaching, or the validity of that teaching. Regardless of problems in the church, the fundamental beliefs must be defended, and one fundamental belief is the inviolability of the seal of confession. That shouldn't be a controversial point, but unfortunately it very much is. Now, obviously, this isn't the first time various states in America have gotten after the seal of confession, nor is this the only place in the Western world to try it either. As I recall, in Australia, the government tried going after the seal of confession in the last couple of years, and various American states continue to try as well. In the U.S., it's always the Party of Moloch that's going after the seal of confession, and that party is the one most Catholics seem to support if the statistics on that are accurate. Back to the article. Quote, on March 3rd, Utah State Party of Moloch Representative Angelo Romero introduced a bill similar to the one in Delaware that would remove the reporting exemptions for clergy and confession on Ted McCarrick problems. The attempt follows an initial attempt by Romero to get the legislation passed in 2020. The first attempt received strong opposition and never made it out of committee. The concept of legislation that negates the privilege of confidentiality in confession is nothing new. States for years have tried to pass similar legislation to the proposed Delaware legislation, to no avail. Other recent examples of state lawmakers proposing this kind of legislation include Wisconsin last year, Montana and North Dakota in 2021, and Arizona in 2020. Many states have passed legislation reported to this kind of reporting, but often it includes exemptions for clergy in the setting of confession. The Diocese of Wilmington noted that in addition to the religious ramifications of the proposed bill in Delaware, it is also a clear violation of the First Amendment for the government to interfere in the most sacred and ancient practice of our faith. The diocese further stated that the legislation would be difficult to adhere to because most sacramental confessions are anonymous, highlighting that in all other circumstances, priests are mandated to report such things. The diocese added that while it supports initiatives to make Delaware a safe place for minors and vulnerable adults, quote, HB 74 would not contribute to such efforts in any meaningful way. The Diocese of Wilmington considers the protection of the vulnerable to be one of the most important aims of public policy, the diocese said. However, this legislation would not advance that vital objective, end quote. No kidding, it wouldn't. This is actually not about public safety anyway. Get to that second, though. Just next door in Vermont, a similar situation is playing itself out. To Alatea, we go for this headline. Priests defend confidentiality of confession against proposed state law. Vermont is the latest state trying to remove priest penitent privilege to combat Ted McCarrick problems in the church. The damage that men like Ted McCarrick have done to the church is incalculable. His sins and the sins of men like him against the most vulnerable may very well result in the freedom of the church being completely prescribed by the secular authorities, who will believe they are acting in defense of those who can't defend themselves. It's a nightmare situation that is the result of laxity on the part of various post-conciliar pontiffs in examining men who are to be promoted to the state of bishop, as those men were then able to change how seminaries examine men who want to be priests. And we've got plenty of stories out there of many of these seminaries in various dioceses, especially ones run by McCarrick and his friends, actively bringing men like that into the priesthood. The consequences of this will be a continuing nightmare for decades to come. But from the Alatea article, quote, the latest attempt to force members of the clergy to report information they learn in confidential settings is taking place in Vermont, and the sole Roman Catholic bishop in the state appeared before a legislative committee to argue against the effort. Bishop Christopher Coyne of Burlington, Vermont, and 2 other Catholic priests sought to assure legislators that it's possible to both protect the vulnerable and preserve religious liberty at the same time. Since the Catholic clergy Ted McCarrick problem started making headlines in the early 2000s, quite a few state and federal governments have tried to eliminate exemptions to mandatory reporting laws that would protect the clergy penitent exemptions. A bill introduced by Vermont State Senator Dick Sears, a member of the party of Moloch from Bennington, would repeal the Green Mountain State's exemption for clergy. Bishop Coyne, appearing before the state's Senate Judiciary Committee in Montpelier, the state capital, on March 3rd, said that Sears' bill, quote, crosses a constitutional protective element of our religious faith, the right to worship as we see fit. The legislative change effectively would require priests to violate the sacramental seal, sometimes called the seal of confession. As Father John Paul Kimes, associate professor of the practice at Notre Dame Law School, noted in his testimony delivered via Zoom, the Code of Canon Law of the Catholic Church states that, quote, the sacramental seal is inviolable. The 1983 revision of the code says it is absolutely forbidden for a confessor to betray in any way a penitent in words or in any manner and for any reason. A priest who reveals what he learns during a sacramental confession is automatically excommunicated. Father Kimes, as a member of the discipline section of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith in the Vatican for 11 years, prosecuted priests for violations of the seal. He said that such priests are subject to, quote, the most severe penalties the Catholic Church has, including dismissal from the clerical state. He said that the English translation of the Code of Canon Law fails to convey the gravity of the matter. The original Latin of the text uses the word nephes, a rarely used word in the code, which translates as abomination, atrocity, or wickedness. The seal dates back to the 10th century, at the very least, he said, and probably goes back much farther. The priest penitent privilege has been, quote, part of our American tradition since at least 1813, he added, when a New York judge affirmed a Catholic priest's right to withhold information on a suspect who had gone to him for confession. End lengthy quote.
My suspicion is that the secular arm, as Vigano calls it in the letters of his recent presenting that I've been presenting on weekends, related to the crushing of religious orders by Francis in cahoots with secular authorities. My suspicion is that the secular arm is less concerned about protecting people, more concerned about keeping the Catholic Church on a leash, especially in light of growing numbers of Catholics re-embracing traditional teachings of the faith that put the Church at odds with the secular world. Most bishops in the trad versus modernist debate are in the middle somewhere. They really are, mostly just wanting to do their jobs and to juggle the various duties they have in an environment of growing uncertainty and growing polarization inside the church and outside of it. The secular arm has shown itself all too interested in these internal debates, as recent stories involving government law enforcement activities have demonstrated. While the states will not be successful at this time in breaking the seal, it is worth noting that the push by various lawmakers to harm the church in this way is ongoing and needs to be recognized for what it is and for where it is coming from. Now, what do you think about this story? Are you confident that most bishops and most priests will resist this overreach by the government? Do you think this would stand up at the Supreme Court? Let me know in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help, as does sharing this on social media. That helps a lot too. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.